Hi, and welcome to 418 Astrology. This is in honor of my new group for Scorpio rising people. I thought I'd go through the chart of a Scorpio rising celebrity and talk to you guys about it, and sort of show you what I teach my students in terms of what's important in an astrology chart. And once you know how to combine symbols, it can be very compelling to look at a tiny detail in a chart and potentially miss the big important messages that the chart is trying to show you or give you. And so I've been working with my students and teaching them a method where you sort of go through it in a certain order. And so I'll give a demonstration of that, and talk a little bit more about Scorpio risings and what we all have in common. So first I'll talk about that. So any rising sign, and you can see here, this is the chart of Jim Carrey. So anyone who is a Scorpio rising has Scorpio in the first house of their chart. So that's easy, obvious, right? And so it makes you, the Scorpio rising person, a certain kind of person. But then the other thing to notice that a lot of people don't think about is the rest of your chart is set up in the same way. All Scorpio risings have Scorpio rising and Taurus descending, for instance. They all have Saturn ruling their childhood and family houses down here, house number 3 and house number 4. One of the ways that I describe this is having the same rising sign. If you grow up in the suburbs, some people would live in neighborhoods where there's maybe 4 or 5 different houses or 4 or 5 different house plans. And so you'd walk into one house and be like, oh, this is just like mine, because I know the bathroom's over here and the bedroom's over here. And people that have the same rising sign as you are a lot like that. But the elements that make up who you are and your personality are all kind of there. And you'll be going through the same transits at the same time. Like right now for Scorpio rising people, we have Jupiter in our 7th house over here of relationships. And wherever Jupiter is one of the biggest and best things that can be going on in a chart. And so there's expansion because Jupiter is all about expansion. And so Jupiter going through the 7th house brings expansion to your intimate relationships. And so all us Scorpio rising people will all have something to talk about because we're all going through the same stuff at the same time. So I wanted to talk about a Scorpio rising celebrity just to kind of get this going. And it's interesting looking at the batch of who the Scorpio rising people are. And if you Google Scorpio rising, things like intense and dramatic come up. Scorpio rising is not quite like having a Scorpio sun or even a Scorpio moon. And obviously there's undoubtedly triple Scorpios out there that have a Scorpio rising, Scorpio sun, Scorpio moon. A rising sign really means that that's the energy that you're challenged to bring into this lifetime. That's an essential part of who you are. And the energy of that ruling planet, which for Scorpio rising people is Mars, is the energy that you need to express out in the world. Your problems are solved or will be solved by Mars energy more than anything else, because you're ruled by Mars. You're here to do Mars's bidding, so to speak. And so the real answer to all your problems is to become more Mars-like. And so that's another thing that unites all of us Scorpio risings. And Jim Carrey is one of them. So just looking at his chart, this is a new chart to me. And a lot of times in classes, I'll talk about a celebrity and you kind of think that you know someone. And really, I just realized talking about these charts that sometimes I just know the highlights of that person's life. But it's always fodder for research later. And it's always interesting to see what comes up in a chart and what's obvious in the chart. So the way I teach people how to approach a chart, obviously, you're reading a chart. This is a psychic reading. You're looking at a whole bunch of symbols. So what jumps out at you first about a chart is always going to be really important. And so I will tell you my first impressions of Jim Carrey's chart. Usually the aspects, which is everything inside this circle, all these lines, the aspects are represented by these lines. Usually people have a lot more aspects. Most people's charts are kind of crisscrossed with these in a way that Jim Carrey's is not. And I would say it's notable for the lack of aspects. And even the aspects that are here are very, very faint, are very, very thin. Like this Pluto at 9 degrees of Virgo, that's a pretty damn faint trine if you're trying to say that planets at 26 degrees of Capricorn are trining it. That's a real trine would be planets at 9 degrees of Capricorn, but he doesn't have that. He has some of these very, very weak trines and squares. And some of these planets, including, I think, Saturn, it's not clear from the drawing, but I think Saturn is totally unaspected. And this little group of planets down here in the third house is also totally unaspected. So what does that mean when there aren't a lot of aspects in the chart? Well, I think it makes the aspects that are there all the more important. The other thing is it makes it hard for a lot of these energies to work together. It can be great, for instance, to have a grand trine. I was looking at someone else's chart. I think it was Whitney Houston's, and she's got a great big grand trine right there. And that makes all the energy from all the points of that triangle work together harmoniously, beautifully. With Jim Carrey's chart, it's not as easy. And so that was a first impression kind of thing that I noticed about his chart. The other thing that stood out to me is Neptune on the ascendant, which I'll come back to. And then all this stuff up here in the area of career. He's got Uranus conjunct midheaven, and then the North Node isn't too far away. So the focus on career is no joke. And we've seen that obviously with celebrities. One of the reasons that people say it can be useful to look at celebrities' charts is because their lives have unfolded in a certain way. They've reached a certain amount of success. And so, and especially with someone like Jim Carrey, who is not, he was born in the 60s, I guess. So he's somewhere in his 50s. So we've seen a lot of what he's doing in his life, and we've seen the trajectory his life has taken. I have a book that's all about astrology for kids, or astrology. It's like an astrology cookbook aimed at kids. It's by Robert Hand, who I think is one of the best astrologers. So in that sense, it's worth having. But when you look at what he writes for kids, it's all about potential. And in an adult's chart, particularly in somebody who's achieved fame of some kind, it's easier to see those energies play out in that person's life. So anyway, going through in my little order that I kind of invented of what's important, but I'll stand by it, or I'll happily debate about it. Maybe people will change my mind. So I say, when you're reading a chart, the most important thing is the first house, and whichever planet rules the first house. So let's see. With Jim Carrey, of course, it's Scorpio rising. And so we know Mars is his ruler. But before we even go to Mars, we look at the first house planet, Neptune. And Neptune is right on the ascendant. What does that mean? So this means Neptune, the planet, had just risen at the moment of his birth. When a planet is on the ascendant, it's probably in the most powerful, most positive place that it could be. And it affects that person's life to a huge degree. And so one of the ways I've heard it described is something like everything that you have, anything in your life, you're looking through this Neptune like stained glass window, looking at life. Your whole life is painted by whatever planet is on the ascendant, and as much as, or perhaps more than, the ruling planet. So this Neptune is very, very important. The other thing that I relate the ascendant to is it's our unique individuality. One of the things that it's very, very connected to, the first house in general and the ascendant, is appearance. So your personal appearance. The ascendant, I would say, go really is literally your face. Your face in the sense that that's you. It's a real identifier. I was watching some movie that was supposed to be about, drug cartels, and in the movie, it was kind of gruesome. They would hang people's bodies, from a bridge or whatever to scare people, but the heads were always missing. And it really makes you think, well, how dehumanizing that is. And when you take apart the human body and you lose the face, you lose the head, you really lose that individuality. And because faces, as we know, are all unique, and your face is personal to you, unique to you, in that it is you in a certain way. Like your brain is right behind it, your eyes are looking out of it. It is you, but at the same time, it's very much what people see. And a beautiful face or a not so beautiful face, or just a face that people respond to, all of this is described by the ascendant. And so one thing that I thought was immediately amusing about Jim Carrey's chart is he has Neptune on the ascendant, as we said. And so think of a face. And then you add the symbol of Neptune. So the way that I teach this, the planets are forces. And Neptune is altering consciousness, altering consciousness, altering consciousness. That's all that Neptune does. And it does it at various strengths in various ways, depending on where it is in the chart. But you can also look at it as blurring or distorting things. And one of the things that Jim Carrey was very famous for, especially earlier on in his career, was having like a rubber mask type face. Like he could make crazy faces, and a lot of his humor centered around that. And people would even said, like, how can this guy make these faces that I couldn't make them and have the same impact. Most people couldn't make them and have the same impact, but Jim Carrey, for whatever reason, could. He was good at it. And so having Neptune on the ascendant is definitely points towards that. And one of the great things about doing astrology is somewhere in the back of your mind, now you've heard Neptune on the ascendant, and so you're likely, if you see it again, to think Jim Carrey. And this is one way it's manifested for one person. I would say that having Neptune on the ascendant would also perhaps make someone confused about their own identity or who they really are. I think that there may be a search for identity. The ascendant is kind of where our consciousness comes into being. It's us as a baby. It's also the unique part of ourselves. The sun has a lot of the experience of our father in it. The moon has a lot of our experience of our mother in it. The ascendant is the part of the chart that is just you. And obviously the whole chart is you, but the ascendant is the you-iest part of the whole chart. It's I have theorized, and I guess there's no way to prove this, but I've theorized that the ascendant represents the part of you that perhaps survives from lifetime to lifetime and comes back again and again to learn new lessons. And here's what the lesson is about this time. It's a Scorpio lesson. And what does that mean? It means it has to do with emotions, because Scorpio is the sign of deep, fixed emotions. And we'll get more into that. But just noticing Neptune on the ascendant is where we'd start with Jim Carrey. And then we'd look at the ruler. The ruler of Scorpio is obviously Mars. Or maybe that's not obvious if you're new to astrology. But one of the nice things about astrology is there's only maybe 36 symbols that you have to learn, and then you can play with them, and the sky's the limit from there, which is really, really fun. And if you think you can't learn 36 symbols, if you watched Game of Thrones, you learned at least 36 characters, right? And you could imagine Would they date each other? You know, would they hate each other? Astrology isn't too different, only you're working with symbols. So looking again at Jim Carrey's chart. So starting with this Neptune on the ascendant, there's also something, the ascendant talks about early life. And really the ascendant is the point where we come into consciousness. And seeing Neptune right there, well, that's the first thing you meet when you're first opening your eyes. This force that is altering consciousness is there. And how would that translate into someone's life? This could translate into someone who was somehow exposed to visionary experiences, or maybe even mind-altering drugs, or early on in life. And so it may have been, for Jim Carrey, one or the other, or this could just be someone that's prone to fantasy or seeing things a little bit differently, which again, it's not until you start talking about a celebrity's chart that you realize how little you know of them. I don't know what his childhood was like. But it would be interesting to see, because it feels like from his ascendant, he'd be looking at things differently right away. So going to the ruler, which I keep saying we're going to do. So the ruler of Scorpio is Mars. And Mars, therefore, this is the next most important thing in Jim Carrey's chart. So here's Mars in Capricorn. This represents Jim Carrey himself, this Mars. I know we said the ascendant was him, but if we're going to pick a planet that's him, it's Mars. He's represented by Mars. And one of the meanings of having a certain sign rising, as I said earlier, is you're here to really initiate that force in yourself and solve problems with it. And so Scorpio rising people are ruled by Mars, and maybe you don't want to mess with them. They are ruled by Mars, but they're here to learn those Mars lessons. And so it can often be gentle people that are here to learn from Mars. And what Mars teaches us at the end of the day is separation. In the same way that Neptune is just altering consciousness all the time, Mars is separating all the time. What does that mean? What does it mean to separate? The joke I usually make is it can be anything from separating your head from your body to separating yourself from the pack and being at the front of a road race kind of thing. And so separating yourself from the crowd, or separating whatever it is that needs separating, is what Scorpio rising people are here to do. And he is here, Jim Carrey, to separate, distinguish himself is probably a good way to put it too. He's here to distinguish himself in the realm of the mind, in the realm of speaking, and because here's his Mars down here. One of the things that I say to my students is you could erase this whole chart. And if you could only have 2 planets in the whole chart, let them be Neptune and Mars, because the whole story is right there. And so what does it mean to have Mars in the 3rd house? So this is someone who wants to distinguish themselves in the area of speaking, communication, and how well is he able to do that? Some of this you can tell right away, because what is the strength of this Mars? This is Mars in Capricorn, and Mars is exalted in Capricorn. And so that's kind of like a mini rulership. It's not his home territory, but it's somewhere where he's thought very well of, Mars. And so this is an active, happy, out there Mars. And you can notice too, that Venus is right nearby. There's a loose conjunction here of Mars with Venus. And Mars is a malefic, but Venus is a benefic. Most of the planets can be sorted into benefic or malefic or indifferent. Benefic means that we generally like the experience of these planets, and malefic means we generally don't. Mars is not evil in any sense of the term, but he is malefic. Like if you think about that separating force, we don't usually like separating. Whatever is, we don't usually like that. If it's something that really needs to be separated, that energy can be very, very welcome. But it's still a malefic force. Like right now, we have a strong Mars going. So our ruler right now is Scorpio rising people is in Scorpio. Mars is somewhere around here right now, present day. And that's a very, very strong Mars. And what it is like a very sharp knife that's very good at separating. And a sharp knife can be a wonderful tool. But we've all thought, we all know how easy it can be to slice something off with a sharp tool and not notice it. But at the same time, if something needs separating, a sharp knife is going to do it like nothing else. Whereas if Mars is over here in Taurus, it's more like a dull knife, where Mars is in its detriment. But anyway, so back to Jim Carrey's Mars. This Mars in the third house can be a little bit difficult to interpret. I have this same placement myself, and the same obviously ruler because I'm a Scorpio rising too. And so my Mars is in a very similar place, and it's also in Capricorn. I was born in a very different year than Jim Carrey, but I have this Mars in Capricorn in the third house too. And so the life purpose is really written in the ruler and where it is. And so what he is here to do is really distinguish himself, separate himself / distinguish himself in the area of speaking, communication, kind of like getting the word out. One of the things that I noticed thinking about this placement for me is like how combative Mars can be. And that's a part of ourselves that we experience as unpleasant. It's malefic, right? But it can actually be a very positive thing. One of my favorite podcast of all time is called Knowledge Fight, and it's sort of a takedown of like bogus things, where they're sort of bringing information to enlighten you, and kind of tell the truth, kind of like a fact checking kind of thing. It's funny and all that stuff too, but I bring it up because it's kind of spelled out here in that Mars in the third house is sort of a knowledge fight kind of idea. The knowledge is in the third house and the fight comes from Mars. And so there can be with this placement kind of getting the truth out kind of energy. And it's been interesting. One of the things that I do know about Jim Carrey is later in his career, more like now, there's a very interesting documentary about him called Jim and Andy that talks about how deeply he went into the role of Andy Kaufman for that Man in the Moon movie. And I would say the documentary is more interesting than the Man in the Moon movie because it's Jim Carrey looking back on this 20 years later and kind of giving his reflection on everything. But he's also getting the word out about a lot of different things. He talks about his own struggles with mental illness and depression. And he talks about when you go that deeply into a character as he did, and he was Andy Kaufman full time, like out there bothering people as Andy Kaufman. When you're in that kind of place, you can lose some of your own personality. And I think from the way he talks in the documentary, I think he he did that and learned how to come back from it, so to speak, or came back from it enough that he has interesting things to say. And it sort of brings together this getting the truth out real point of his life. If the point was acting, say, if his life purpose were acting, how would that be expressed in the chart? It might be more of a 10th house emphasis, or a 5th house emphasis. This is really about, he's really here to impart knowledge. And so these are the first things to notice in Jim Carrey's chart. And also notice too, that this is a strong Mars, but it's not really talking to anybody else in the chart, so to speak. It's not supported by, he's got some very strong planets over here. This Saturn in Aquarius, we'll come back to that. It's not really supported by any of the other planets in the chart. It's kind of all by its lonesome. And interestingly, when you look at the Jim Carrey of today, at least as presented in this documentary, he's someone who is kind of changed by everything that he's gone through. And is here now, sort of like the narrator from Moby Dick is sort of here now to tell the tale kind of thing, which goes very much with this Mars and Capricorn placement. So after we look at the first house, any planets in it, especially any planets on the ascendant, and then we look at the chart ruler, the next most important thing after that, so we've done sort of number 1 and number 2. The next most important thing after that is seeing whether it's a day or night chart, and depending on which kind of chart it is, going to either the sun or the moon. So this is a nighttime chart for Jim Carrey, who was born around 2:30 a.m. And one of the ways you can tell a night chart from a day chart is, well, depending on the house system you're using. I'm a big believer in whole sign houses, at least for most things. For horror areas, I use a different system because it gives you a little bit more information. But generally speaking, whole sign houses, I'll fight to the death for them. So using whole sign houses, sometimes you have to look at where the ascendant is here. So it's really at 15 degrees of Scorpio. In some other house systems, the ascendant will be this line right here. But either one, if the sun is below this line that kind of cuts the whole chart in half, if the sun is down here, as it is in the case of Jim Carrey, you have a night chart. And so that makes the moon more powerful, more important than the sun in a chart. And the sun is still the next thing in line, but before we talk about the sun in a night chart, we should be talking about the moon. So we talked about someone who might be born not really knowing who they are, or having some kind of fuzzy sense of who they are, which again goes into the Andy Kaufman thing very, very well. This is someone who is able to imitate another person to a huge degree and almost become like synonymous with them. So that really matches Neptune on the ascendant. And then we talked about really getting the truth out for Jim Carrey and really kind of being like a speaker of truth, and that being super important to him. So those are the most important things. But after coming into that, let's look at his moon. So his moon is here in the 8th house. One of the things to notice when you're looking at any chart is you start to sift through these important things, and different astrologers might have a different take on what's the most important. I suppose it is, there's no wrong way to read a chart. I could argue for why the order that I do things is the right way, but I'm open to doing it differently. But going through a chart sort of methodically, like I'm doing here, can be a really good exercise about what's important, what's not important. But it's also helpful to notice what's happening to the planets as you look at the ruler, as you look at the sun, as you look at the moon. Are these planets being harmed? Are these planets being hurt by malefic planets? Are they aspecting malefic planets? Are they in a bad house? And the reason that I'm thinking of this is he's got the moon in the 8th house. And if you go back in time with astrology, we love to use old sources, but the further you go back in time, they'll say, you know, this is a bad thing, this is a good thing. And that can scare people, which I don't like as a more modern astrologer. And there is usually a more positive way to phrase things. But when astrology was the tool that you had for everything, you really needed to know what was going to be good and what was going to be bad, what was going to suck and what wasn't. And so it can be useful to kind of keep that good or bad stuff in the back of your mind, because then you can kind of sort out what charts are really trying to say. And it helps you get some shades of meaning. We haven't really seen so far difficulty in his chart. And we've done the two most important things, which is the first house and the rulers and the ruling planet. And so we haven't run into anything that's like, ooh, that's gnarly. This 8th house moon, kind of gnarly. It's not the worst thing in the world. And you can see from it's trining these other planets down here. And so it's being helped by the big guys, by Saturn and Jupiter, which is very, very positive for this moon. So that helps it. But before we get into aspects, let's look at the moon itself and what this moon is doing. So in the way that I said that Neptune is always altering consciousness, altering consciousness, altering consciousness, Mars is always separating. The moon is always feeling. There are old charts of planetary dignity saying which signs that planets are happiest in. And of course, the signs that they rule are the ones that they tend to be happiest in. And the ones right across the way from the signs that they rule, they're miserable in. But there are charts, old figures that go back to, I mean, really, really far back, that will can tell you how dignified any planet is at any point in the chart. But you kind of have to have those charts of planetary dignity around. And I think it's better when you can, to kind of figure out the symbolism yourself and figure out how well a planet can function. And if you know the essence of what a planet's doing, in that, you know, Mars is always trying to separate. There's various signs where that would be harder to do. And so you know that Mars isn't going to like it there. You can kind of figure it out on your own. And the moon is kind of like that. So it's in the 8th house, which is called a bad house. And in more traditional astrology, this was the house of death. I think of it more as like the house of vulnerability. Whatever's in the 2nd house over here, the houses are all they're sort of like 6 interwoven yin yangs, in that each house means the opposite of the one across from it. So the 2nd house is where we feel secure. That's where all our stuff is. The 8th house is where we feel insecure, where we don't have our stuff, where we might die, where we're afraid. It's vulnerability. And does the moon like to feel vulnerable? No. I would say no. The moon in Gemini, it's a mutable air sign. But if you think of one of the ways that I picture the sign of Gemini, so it's an air sign, right? So it's not made of stuff, it's made of air and sound. And so if you just picture, almost like when you tune the old-fashioned radio in your car and you go across the dial and you can hear little snippets of this conversation or that conversation or a snippet of music, that's Gemini. that chatter is Gemini, that what here is going to hold my interest and make me stay here. And so that doesn't really mix with the moon either, because the moon wants to feel. And so someone with the moon in Gemini, where they feel best is a place where there is going to be a lot of chatter like that. There is going to be a lot of stimulation like that. And since this is moon and Gemini in the 8th house, I would paint all of that in a dark color. That there's something about being, there's something about emotionally vulnerable chatter, that this is what this person really needs. And you could translate that into different specific words. But that's sort of essentially what it comes down to. The same astrologer that I mentioned earlier, who I really like, Robert Hand, I think it was him who said this. He said astrology is really good at telling you the kind of thing. It can tell you roughly what something is, or what something is like. And sometimes you have to layer a lot of astrological insights on top of each other, and you can get something really precise, and it's like this kind of thing. But yeah, I would say he feels best, someone with this placement would feel best with emotionally vulnerable chatter. So that's interesting. And that's not the hardest thing in the world to find, but it's not the easiest thing in the world to find either. The way that this moon trines Saturn and Jupiter, it's getting help from the 4th house because these trines are here. And so that's worth noticing too. Sometimes I'll go into rulerships, and rulerships are some of the most important thing that you can look at aside from planetary strength. The ruler of this moon is Mercury, which is here also trining the moon directly. So this moon is ruled by this Mercury down here, Mercury in Aquarius, which is a very happy Mercury. And this very happy Mercury is ruled in turn by Saturn, who is in its own rulership down here. So this moon, it's very well supported for this emotionally vulnerable chatter, if that makes sense. And all of these planets down here really talk about home life and the home life that he would have experienced. One of the reasons that we say that Scorpio risings can be kind of, I don't know, like darker people or sadder people or more melancholy type of people, is the 2 signs ruled by Saturn, as I was saying earlier, are down here in family and childhood. And so the signs ruled by the malefics, you can look at those as sort of like the darkest parts of the chart. And the darkest part of the chart is here around home and family. We haven't really picked apart what that means for Jim Carrey. And it may mean more or less. If we were looking at a different Scorpio rising person that had all their planets up here and none of them down here in the 3rd or 4th house, it may not mean as much. But that we do have Saturn in its rulership, there's strength here. There's some good stuff happening here, as well as old karma. And you can see the south node of the moon here, which is sort of like a cosmic junk pile is the way that I look at it. And it's old karma. If you've ever had the experience of, like, I don't know, cleaning something out or coming across some trash or something, and then all of a sudden you realize it's your trash. It's like, ooh, those are my old school notes. That's my old stained clothes. That's my old stuff. And it's very personal. That's south node of the moon energy. And so there's some complicated stuff in the family here, but not all bad. but we're getting far afield from that moon. But somehow I think it's fair to say that he may have learned his emotionally vulnerable chatter at home. That may be a strength of his family growing up. And I remember in the Jim and Andy documentary, he talks really favorably about his father. The father is also represented by the fourth house, and often by the planet Saturn. And so that there were good things happening with the father doesn't surprise me. But back to our agenda of looking at the most important things first. And as you can see, I've been talking for like 45 minutes, and we did the first house, planets on the ascendant, we did the ruler, we're still only on the moon. And it's totally okay to get into the minutia of a chart. But I try to encourage people to really look at the important things, because then you know the main story that's being told, and go off on all the side quests you want, but at least know that they're side quests. And so back to our main quest here, which is the moon. So we know this good feeling from vulnerable chatter is being helped by the home life. Good. So where do we go next? We did the first house, the planets in the first house, especially on the ascendant, the chart ruler, and the moon would be called the sect ruler. Day versus night is sect. And so we already did the moon. The next comes the sun. So the sun, where the moon wants to feel, and the sun, I haven't really picked a verb for the sun yet. Willing is really the most accurate verb that I can pick, but it's also a verb that's difficult to explain. Something like, but maybe I'll try to explain it. It goes all the way down to your will to live, willing on that sense, your vitality. So that form of willing is wrapped up in the sun. The other form of willing is sort of like, it's the sun's job to either like or not like things. It either says yes or no to them. The sun either lights up or it doesn't light up, kind of thing. According to its will, what it wants. And this is the more, people will point out that this is the more extroverted between the sun and the moon. The sun is more extroverted, whereas the moon is more about feelings. So what is this sun willing? And wrapped up in the sun is self-esteem, the whole kit and caboodle. So what is this sun willing? Well, we notice that it's in the third house. We're going back to Mars. We notice that it's in the third house, and so communication is back on the table, so to speak. And so we can see that Jim Carrey's self-esteem would be very wrapped up in, again, this speaking, talking, communicating, thinking. This is all third house stuff. And with Capricorn in the third house, this would be more competitive. Talking, thinking, speaking. That's why I was saying, it's like a knowledge fight, so to speak. So his self-esteem would be very wrapped up in his ability to speak, his ability to get his message across, his ability to communicate, discover new things. It's all kind of packed in here together. And so the sun in Capricorn, is the sun in Capricorn happy? It's ruled by Saturn. And this is a very strong Saturn. It's actually, this Saturn conjoins the sun, which for the sun itself, which is the one we're talking about right now, is a bad thing. It makes the sun weaker. But Saturn itself is strong. And we haven't really talked about what Saturn is doing over here in the 4th house. And the drawing doesn't really show this, but these planets are only 5 degrees away from each other. And so they're influencing each other hugely. This is really a Sun-Saturn conjunction that Jim Carrey has. So this Sun, as we said, it wants to do the same thing that Mars does, which is a good thing. In terms of accomplishing one's life purpose. If your self-esteem is kind of in the same place, it helps you achieve that life purpose. For instance, like some people will have a life purpose around career, but the sun and the moon might tell you that they have to be happy in their intimate relationship before they can even think about career. Whereas the sun and Mars are kind of united in this purpose together. So that's a nice thing to see. But I would say the fact that these planets, Mars and the sun, are not really aspected by anything. Maybe a little bit to Neptune over here, a little bit to Pluto. I don't think these are significant aspects. And as you can see, I've turned off all of the aspects except for the Ptolemaic ones. So I really just use the trine, the opposition, the square, and the sextile. And you just don't run out of things to talk about with that. And someday if I do, then we'll get into even the more fine detail. But I don't think most of the time that you really need it. Because if something isn't expressed by one of those 4 major aspects, and of course the conjunction, which is the most important aspect when planets are right on top of each other. But if something isn't expressed by those big guys, it tends to be a really fine detail of the chart that if you're looking in the shrubbery for answers, you're probably in the wrong place. So that's why I just use those very simple aspects. So we looked at the sun, and we noticed that this sun is really not aspected by any other planets other than it's conjoins Venus and it conjoins Saturn, and very loosely you could say it conjoins Mars. But other than that, it's not really speaking to any of the other planets. So this might be someone, this is someone who wants to speak. This is someone who wants to get the word out. And I think he was married to Jenny McCarthy at one point. And I think he did some activism with her around like vaccines and autism. That was probably a really good time for him, because he would have been doing what he's here to do, which is to kind of like speak the truth, or speak what he sees as the truth. And you notice too that that Venus, which would stand in for it would stand in for his wife or his life partner, whoever that would be now. But also, we only have so many pieces of the game board with astrology. So if Jim Carrey is married now, it's her, but it's also Jenny McCarthy. It's any woman in his life has to take this Venus role. But if you notice, Venus is down here with the sun and Mars, where Venus is an outspoken truth teller too. And so that describes very much something that he might be looking for in a partner, which is why I said he was probably very happy at that time. Or that was probably a time of feeling really fulfilled. So one thing that's interesting, having gotten this far, and again, I always say you could stop the chart stop the chart analysis with the ruler. And sometimes you can stop just with the sun and the moon. You could stop at this point, and we've gone a full hour without getting into any of just doing the major players for Jim Carrey. Well, one thing that I notice is we haven't really come across anything that's specifically humor or acting. Not specifically. The other night, we looked at not Jim Carrey, Matthew Perry's chart. who unfortunately just died this week. But sometimes when somebody's in the news, it can be a good time to pull out their chart and see what it says. And there were several things in Matthew Perry's chart that pointed to, this is an entertainer, this is a funny guy. Other than that Neptune on the ascendant and the distorted face image that brings up, which isn't one-to-one with funny either. Or I guess people who are fans of that period of Jim Carrey's work might disagree and say a funny face is the key to comedy. There's nothing here of that screams that, which I think is an interesting thing to notice. And there's also nothing here that screams tortured soul in the way that, unfortunately, looking at Matthew Perry's chart, there was a lot, just starting with the chart rulers and the sun and the moon. There was a lot there where you could say, oh, I can see why there's pressures on this part of this person's personality that might have made this hard or that hard. And we haven't seen that yet with Jim Carrey, which I think is also interesting. Let's see, this feels like a natural stopping point. I may do Jim Carrey part 2, but I've enjoyed this very much. And if you've lasted this long, thank you very much. And I'll be back soon with more. Thank you.